Yes, this is really important. Since at least the 1970s, the Israeli state has wanted to turn critiques of Zionism and the Israeli state into anti-Semitism. So this is where you started to see the emergence of this new concept called the new anti-Semitism. And the whole thinking behind this new anti-Semitism is that critiques, serious, decolonial, anti-racist critiques of Zionism and the Israeli state constitute anti-Semitism. Now, this is absurd. From a logical point of view, from a factual point of view, it doesn't make any sense. So it was a blatant attempt to weaponize anti-Semitism in order to shield Israel from serious critiques such as those presented by the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation. But this weaponization of anti-Semitism may be serving the Israeli state in some respects, meaning that it allows the Israeli state to conceal its crimes. It allows it to conceal its settler colonial nature. It allows it to conceal apartheid to some extent within institutions that we find in places like the UK, France, Germany, Canada, the US, and elsewhere. But in the long term, and even in the immediate term, there are also some very dangerous consequences of weaponizing anti-Semitism. So in that article, I laid out three main negative consequences of this effort to weaponize anti-Semitism. Number one is that it does censor Palestinian speech, political speech. It does prevent Palestinians from sharing their experiences of expulsion, of the Nakba, of uninhibited state violences that are committed against them, as we witness today, trying to share their experiences of an ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people by the Israeli state. So it affects Palestinians first and foremost in that we are unable to narrate our story on our own terms. Because the second we do that, we are charged of being quote unquote anti-Semitic and therefore guilty of hate speech. So this has serious consequences for the, for the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian struggle, for people's livelihoods. People risk losing jobs. People have lost jobs because they were quote unquote anti-Semitic, but while all they're really doing is just asking for Palestinian freedom and liberation and equal rights. So that's the number one consequence. Number two, it also hurts Jewish communities in Canada, in the US, in the UK, in France, and beyond. So one of the anti-Semitic tropes that has always existed for a really long time is the notion that Jewish people, regardless of their country of residency and their country of citizenship, their actual country, always have a stronger allegiance to the Israeli state or to some kind of Zionist conspiracy or whatever. And that has led to some, devastating consequences for members of the Jewish community. People who are, Canadian Jews somehow treated with suspicion because, people suspect that their allegiance is not to Canada, but to some other project, global project, or to Israel or something like that. So that's an anti-Semitic trope. But that's precisely what the Israeli state and pro-Israel lobby groups, that's precisely the kind of narrative that they push when they keep telling the world that Jews everywhere have this connection to Israel and are committed to the Israeli state project. This is a lie. Many Jewish groups and communities and individuals are opposed to Zionism and identify as anti-Zionist. Many have no connection whatsoever with the Israeli state and don't really care about it that much. But since this narrative keeps being pushed forward by the Israeli state and pro-Israel lobby groups, it actually is advancing that anti-Semitic trope that I discussed. So it turns members of the Jewish community in places like Canada and the US and elsewhere into groups that have this kind of allegiance to the Israeli state. So this has dangerous consequences. And as we're seeing this now, many people are associating the genocidal operation that the Israeli state is committing to Jewish community members here. And obviously that's wrong. That shouldn't be done. The people to blame for that connection is Israel, the Israeli state, and pro-Israel lobby groups who have made that connection over decades in order to weaponize anti-Semitism. And third, the third consequence also is negative consequences for members of the Jewish community in Western Europe and North America specifically, because people know that it's not really anti-Semitism when people call for a free Palestine. People know the charges of anti-Semitism directed at students and faculty, for example, in university campuses when they try to hold hold an event to talk about Palestinian liberation or Palestinian rights or anything related to Palestine, really, that those events are somehow anti-Semitic and should therefore be canceled, people know that that is not an honest argument. People know that that is not a solid argument. People know that it is a false accusation of anti-Semitism. Now, what this ends up doing then in people's minds is to go, they start to have this kind of knee-jerk reaction that every time they hear of an anti-Semitic charge being directed against someone, they go, oh, well, that's probably a made-up charge in order to silence Palestinians and critiques of the Israeli state. And that's dangerous too, because anti-Semitism is real. It does exist. And when you dilute the meaning of anti-Semitism and you dilute the charge of anti-Semitism, then people start to not believe the charge anytime it appears, even when it actually is being directed against something that is in fact anti-Semitic. So in all of those ways, this weaponization is dangerous, like I said, for Palestinians and Jews, and should be opposed, should be called out, and should be stopped immediately, this weaponization of anti-Semitism.